you get this whole generation of people and generations later who were desperately interested in learning about their family history and really had to kick down doors, just like I did, to have access to that. The reason why I became certified was because being that young, being somebody who was from the hood, who didn't come from this, upper middle class background. And while I definitely have a lot of mixed race ancestry, probably a majority of it is, I didn't present like that. I'm a dark-skinned little queer kid from the Bay, right? And I'm dealing with people in Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana. You know what I mean? I just want y'all to and I got a chipped tooth if y'all can't see it. And so it wasn't nothing cute about me in the awkward teenage years. And so going to these spaces, right, meant that everybody questioned my intentions, they questioned my capabilities, and they also wanted specifically to deter me from that because it showed that, the little bright and pretty parts of ancestry were really about to be kind of tilted on its head to focus people who resembled me more closely, right? Who resembled us more closely. And so I became certified so that way I could at least have that little bit of credentialing to teach, to share, and to also continue to build power with others. I don't recommend that for anybody because right now, what we're doing is we're flushing that whole system down the drain and making this accessible for all of us. We don't need that. You don't need a certificate to brush your teeth, right? But maybe you need a certificate to be able to operate on somebody else's. So that's the reason why I do that, because this is something that's full time for me. And just to speak directly to the certification process, there's two main certifying organizations. One is the Board of Certified Genealogists, and then the other one is the Federal Society of Genealogists. I think I'm saying that right. I'm certified by both of them. Actually, I have not renewed my certification in a while because I just don't see a point in it. That's me giving money to an organization that only until the last couple of years elected their first Black president of the organization. And it's a Black woman who comes from an upper, probably a lower high class, if you really want to call it that, family, who comes from a long line of attorneys and fits their, at least fits those check boxes. Ain't no hating, I'm not hating on sis. Some of y'all might be related to her. I guarantee you somebody in here is related to each other. And I hope that we do get to that. But all that being said, it was unnecessary. Going through that certification process was, basically being asked if you could research white families. Researching a white family, I could do with my eyes closed because most of it is already done already. To segue just a little bit, and just because I know we got a little late start, I do want to just give us a little quick rundown on the history of genealogy. Genealogy, really as we know it, was started as a eugenics, basically was one of the foundational parts of eugenics. So from the late 1800s to about the 1940s, eugenics really was the common language of this country and pretty much all Western countries. And so the idea of it was that if you were a white person, you had to be the right kind of white. You had to descend not only from Anglo-Saxon people, so people from the British Isles, but you also had to descend from pretty wealthy ones too, or at least those that were considered free in status. You weren't supposed to be any kind of dark haired. You weren't supposed to be Sicilian, any kind of Italian, that was the whole point. And they wanted to make sure that they were clearing the check boxes of whiteness, right? And making sure that anybody who isn't included in this can be sterilized, murdered, and all of the above. And so it really was a justification for white supremacy. That was the foundational purpose of genealogy as we know it today. But for Black folks and people of the global South, genealogy was not the words that they used, right? So lineages have always been important to our people, and especially those of you guys coming into, coming into connecting to ancestry on a spiritual level. I know you guys know this already, but our people have always valued each other and our lineages. And that's damn near everybody else but white people. And the only lineages that white people valued are those that lie, pillage, kill, steal, and destroy, right? That's the only thing that they care about. even if they're not saying that directly. You know, if they want to say that they descend from King Charlemagne, they don't want to say about what genocidal principles King Charlemagne had, right? They don't want to talk about they'll say, oh, I descend from William the Conqueror. There's already something in that name, right? But they don't want to say, you know, well, William the Conqueror, the killer, but William the Conqueror, this great, rich, wonderful hero, this leader, right? And so that's the point of genealogy for them. You'll never hear a white person talk about their ancestors and be proud of the ancestors who were poor, or the ancestors who were ugly, the ancestors who, you know, did things that were morally wrong in the white eye. But if they did things that were morally right, which usually is morally wrong for us, they love it. They eat it up. And they're the ones who control the genealogy world to this day. And so that, I do want to just leave that there. That is what, if you all continue on this path, that is something that you will have to continuously have in the back of your mind, especially when we are visualizing and connecting with our ancestors, to not bring that same kind of logic.
Woo! Wow, thank you so much. It's so fitting as a historian to give us the history of genealogy. I see a lot of people in the comments saying that they didn't know that's where it started from. But you're absolutely correct in terms of thinking about white people thinking about their ancestral lineage. They love to tell you about the amazing people, the famous people, the people that created this settlement and this town, and run away from the fact that some of their last names are the last names on plantation signs. Thank you so much. And I appreciate you having this perspective and this mindset, because within this space, within this circle, we're very much so grounded in that pre-genealogy perspective of ancestral lineage. So it may be a good idea to, I mean, when I'm thinking about myself, changing my vocabulary around genealogy, doing my genealogy, we're going to call it something different from now on. Do you have any suggestions? Any suggestions?
Ooh. So I consider genealogy really the field of family history research and history. Genealogy is kind of like I think I said it yesterday to another group that I was teaching. Genealogy is like the stepchild of history that's a cousin of genetics, you know, like that's kind of where genealogy fits. It's not a real field for all intents and purposes. It's really like not a real field that like has any real full grounding, even as white people practice it. But I will use the word family history. I will use the words roots. But I really like to just think of, you know, just our family stories, our people stories, and go from there. Because genealogy is not something that just rolls off of our tongues anyways, when you really learn the roots of that word even.
You know what? When you say that, it makes so much sense, because I've had to write this word multiple times in like preparing for this conversation. And the way it's spelled, I'm like, it spells so ugly. I spell it wrong every single time. But
my resume, I had somebody prepare my resume, like some little county, you know, public works place. And when I was talking about what I was doing, the guy put gynecology on it. So I went to a job application, and I'm like maybe 17 or so. And I went to this job interview, and the woman interviewing starts buckling over laughing. And I'm like, okay, but like, what the hell are you laughing at now? It's not that damn funny. And she was like, because you need to go and edit your resume. And she was like, you put gynecology on your resume. And so, yeah, it's definitely not something that's just easy to write out.
What a story. What a story. Thank you so much for blessing us with that perspective. So considering the Ma'afa, which a lot of us know as the transatlantic slave trade, in terms of doing family history or tracing your roots or ancestral history work, as Black people, we can run into a lot of hard stops, rocks in the road, direction changes. I know that in terms of, using ancestry.com to kind of just begin a very rudimentary family tree. 3 hours into that, I was bawled over crying. Bawled over crying. Why? Because I hit a road stop on one of my maternal lineages and could not find any names before that name. And the anger, the rage was very accessible to me in that moment. You know, we think about the transatlantic slave trade, we think about, you know, what they call the slaves, which were our ancestors. We learn the history, and there's a certain level of removing from it or being distant from the experience emotionally of the breaks in the lineages that we felt there. But doing the genealogy and running into that roadblock hurt so deeply, so deeply. So that in the beginning of this conversation, when you said it's not for the faint of heart, I understand what you mean. So in terms of considering our unique lineage issues, those of us who have ancestors who were brought via the transatlantic slave trade to this side of the world, are there any unique trends you've discovered about Black ancestral histories, like bumps in the road stops, extended or blended families that might have happened, family members not being documented in certain censuses for certain reasons, Hoodoo family rituals that kept the lineage's name? Anything unique to us that you found that you find requires us to have a lot of nuance when we're looking at our histories?
I love that. That's such a specific question that I will say I have never been asked in like this format before. And I just want to say thank you so much for that. Because a lot of folks do not think of it in that term or on those terms. So one of the biggest things about Black genealogy is that it is very, very nuanced. We are such a unique group, especially as African Americans. We're such a unique group with a unique history. And so there's no one way to skin a cat. I don't know if y'all familiar with that saying, but one of the biggest things is in researching Black genealogy, we have to come at it from an approach that, again, protects and guards us from the harm that our ancestors already endured, because we're uncovering all of these things. But we also have to have a very specific philosophy and approach to doing genealogy. One of the biggest things, the baselines of genealogy is, we're told, is to start with yourself and work your way back, right? But with Black folks, we don't really have a general idea of what we're working our way back to. We might say, actually, because I talk too much, can we just have a quick little shout out with folks to come off mute and just say a couple things that you might think might come up in a Black genealogy?
Feel free. I see some comments already about people saying things that have come up, but feel free to come off mute, y'all.
If I may share one thing that I didn't expect, because I knew that there are roadblocks and hindrances. The first time I saw my ancestors listed as chattel and as property on someone's slave registry. We know about slavery conceptually, but to see that brought me to my knees. And that was really hard, and I hadn't done any work to prepare. And I don't know what the work would be to prepare for that, but that was something that took me by surprise.
Got you. Diane, I see you got your hand up.
For me, it has come down to the way my ancestors' names were changed. My father's first name was Charles. At one point in my research, I found a marriage license for him from his first marriage where they changed his first name to Charlie, because calling him Charles, that name was too good for him, they thought. And I found that with a lot of my other ancestors, that a name has been changed, definitely without their permission. And it makes me so angry, because it's already hard enough researching our family histories, and I'm the last of my line. All my elders have crossed over. They're all gone. There's no one I can talk to about this. And then to have to deal with people just arbitrarily changing their names makes me so angry.
I hear that. Both of you guys.
I see Twyla. Twyla has her hand up.
One thing that I found in trying to to trace my own family history is that the Great Migration severed a lot of family ties. And, you know, if you look, like I've met people using the genealogy websites like the Ancestry and all that, and we have no idea how we're related. But if we look at census records, our families were like on adjacent farms up until the 40s, until everybody started moving north. And it's like we just lost all these connections. The other thing I noticed is a lot of the ways we construct family don't really have a lot to do with the European legal systems. And so there's a lot of informal adoptions and other things like that. And so it can be hard to trace people through records because the way we look at family and the way we construct our kin has nothing to do with what these other people recognize.
Correct. Absolutely.
Let's take this last one. That's very true.
Another one?
I saw somebody.
Okay, Melanie. There we go. Melanie.
Yeah. One of the things I noticed is, especially a lot of Black Americans have Indigenous heritage. And so I work with those ancestors. I talk to them. The people that had the last bit of information about the tribes are all gone though, and they didn't pass that down. And because of them being Black, there were other aspects to how they weren't able to get enrolled with the tribe, how they weren't accepted in the reservation. So there's this whole other aspect that I've had to learn and reconcile with while doing this family history research, mainly because this information has just been destroyed. And really, when I look at the history between the division of the Indigenous and Black communities, it all still comes down to colonization and white people feeding those seeds in the first place. The other thing that kind of comes up that makes it hard going through genealogy is the dreams. Sometimes looking at certain records, going down certain pathways, an ancestor will come and share a memory with me, and I wake up not knowing what to do with that. And so being able to actually work in family history and do this kind of research requires so much trauma work on myself to be able to hold space for these things that for me are unimaginable to go through, but I know that it's there. I feel it. They show it to me, and it's a lot.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We have Kishana, and if there's one more person afterwards, we'll take the person next.
The thing really just punched me in my chest is one of our family names. We always said Inge, right? And I was like, Inge, like, what is that? What is that? And then we all took the Ancestry DNA test. And my mother had a little piece of germ, and I was like, what? And I heard, like, it's almost like somebody whispered in my ear, it's Inga. That name is actually Inga. And then when I started looking and knowing where my family is in Alabama, exactly, there was a German family. And then just making that realization of what that was, it was a lot. It was a lot. And I'm still trying to deal with that. And when I told my mother, she was just like, whoa.
All of you guys shared. Thank you all so much for sharing those things. One of the, and it's interesting because you guys bring up a lot of the points that I actually wanted to share about as well. Part of those things are very specific, not just to Black genealogy, but those are very prevalent things that shapes Black culture, right? And so we have to keep all of those things in mind when we're researching. Name changes, like being called Charles to Charlie. While that's not something that's just specific to the Black history, that is something that like is interchangeable, you know, in all cases. There's all these different variations of names that one person will say, the next person will say. My mama might call me Alexander, but everybody else might call me Alex. You know, that those are just things that can apply. Having mixed race ancestry, having some German person, possibly most likely a man, being the progenitor of a family. Those are all very real things. And I don't want to dismiss anything that anybody else shared. All of you guys shared really powerful points. But a couple things that comes to mind is that our people go through these various parts of history. So our people's history by no means started in slavery, right? By no means. They took people and they made them slaves here. And so, or they enslaved them here. I don't use the word slave. But all that being said, when they're being enslaved, they're being documented as property and not people. But also every region that enslaves folks that we most likely all descend from, they all had various different approaches to the way they recorded people, to the way they treated people, to the work that people were doing. If your folks are from South Carolina and mine are from Virginia, my folks was growing tobacco, yours was growing rice, right? And so these are very, very distinct things. And then to top that off, throughout that, if your folks are from Virginia or you're more recently from Virginia and I'm, you know, from the deep South, I'm from Alabama, your folks are most likely going to be the people who weren't sold away. But I'm going to be that cousin, that niece, that daughter, that son who was sold and taken. You know what I mean? And so those things, those soul ruptures, I had an elder who has passed away now, but she referred to these moments as soul ruptures. And that changed the way that I approach this genealogy stuff altogether, because all of it was less about, you know, just separations and being sold away or, you know, some other traumatic moments, but soul ruptures, literally removing people from lands, from community, from love that they were so familiar with, for the only things that actually belong to them. Those rupture our lineages, right? And people don't just forget that. That is in our blood now. In fact, when some folks were talking about just the records being destroyed, our blood is the record, right? And so that's something that I try to lean back on. The nuances of Black genealogy means that we're coming with all of the ways that Black culture manifests itself. So play cousins and play aunties. How do we trace that? How do we invalidate that, right? If these people were as important to our lineages as our blood ancestors, right? That was something that was created not just out of slavery, but that's a very African tradition. And all that being said, those people are also things that those are also routes that we have to take to understand our full histories. People that were born out of wedlock, right? Those situations, which literally every family has, nobody's exempt. Somebody on here got a half sister, brother, cousin that they don't know about, I guarantee you. And that's no shade, that's no tea, but that is the way that our people have had to operate because of the nuances of this country, right? Somebody in here, including myself, Pa might not be Pa. And that's the stuff that we will have to come across in our ancestry. I know y'all know Pa not Pa. I know y'all know the color purple. I just hope so. But all that being said, those are some of the things. Seeing your ancestors written as property, that's another big thing. Having a surname and, you know, thinking automatically that the last name that your family carries comes from the last slave owner that they had. 9 times out of 10, that's not the case, right? And that's what my research pretty much proves right now. But all those things are very, very nuanced, but also just how do we even get the documentation that leads to that? That is the most nuanced part of Black genealogy. Who are the people that you have to come in contact with? When I started, like I said, I was this chip-toothed, big-eared little Black boy with a little lisp in his voice and a little, you know, loose hand, right? In the South. And it's mostly white women, old white women, working behind counters at courthouses and archives, courthouses that I would find out my ancestors were sold on the front steps of, right? And so I'm going there and I'm asking to look for things. I'm asking to look at 200, 100 plus year old documents, sometimes even just to request my mother's birth certificate. And I have somebody sitting behind this desk that says, I don't think this has nothing to do with you. Or you ain't gonna find nothing. They didn't record them niggers. Or boy, and this is 2012, right? or in my most recent case, 2022. All right. So all that being said, those are things that specifically comes up when it comes to Black genealogy, but Black genealogy is not only a horror story. And so I hope that we also can kind of talk about that too.
Ooh. Bless your heart for being so invested in this work that you do, that you are the face that's willing to go and have the conversation with the Karens who are gatekeeping information about our lineage. Thank you for doing that so we don't have to. Whew, that immediately triggered. But yes, all of those different unique circumstances we find ourselves in. Paul, not Paul. You know, I was just here with my sister yesterday, and she just found out that her father has a 20-year-old daughter that she never told anybody about, who wouldn't have been on the census records, who in 100 years from now, if they were to look back at the papers of who was in the household, would not have been there. And you know, she's only a couple years, she was 7 or 8 years older than that sister. So we have a lot of those things, and I do, while they can be tough and they can be uncomfortable, keeping those in mind can really help us to get a beautiful picture of what was going on, or a clearer picture at very least of what was going on in our ancestral lineages. So I kind of want to switch gears a little bit. Like you said, it was not completely a horror story. I'm curious about what kind of healing you've seen happen when people get to learn more about their family histories. I'm sure as a Black person, you've been on the side of being, you know, a professional genealogist and assisting people in finding their records, but also having the emotional, psychological, spiritual connection with the people that you're helping. And I can only imagine some of the transformations that you might have seen happen in families once they get some of this information. So
Right.
if you could speak to some of the beauty that has come, that you've seen from folks accessing the information.
Absolutely. I'll start with myself, with what genealogy healed for myself and continues to. You know, I grew up, my parents both grew up as, you know, basically like comfortable, semi-comfortable Black folks, you know, in the 60s and 70s. They grew up here in the Bay Area. Their parents were, you know, just middle-class working people, freedom fighters, and the whole nine. But their children did not have that experience whatsoever, right? My parents were targeted by, you know, the crack epidemic. They were targeted by, you know, health crisis, so on and so forth. And we reaped the consequences of that largely, right? And so I found, though, that the things that my parents lived through, right, the things that they were born into, were things that they inherited in many ways from their own families, from their lineages. And so specifically speaking to my mom's family, to my maternal ancestry, there's a history of very, very powerful Sagittarian women, okay? My mom included, her grandmother, and then her grandmother, and then that woman's three aunts were all Sagittarius. Going back to 1872 was the earliest one that I know for fact was a Sag. All of them just crazy, but they all endured so many different forms of trauma in every episode of that. And so starting with my earliest ancestor, who, like my mom and our branch, kind of venerated this woman. I'm named after her father. Her name was Almeda Nixon. She was born in 1872 to former slaves. Very, you know, beautiful woman in whatever standard you're looking at. But this woman was an absolute hoe, if you ask anybody who knew her. She was the cleanup woman, the home wrecker. She was all the things, you know, everything but a child of God, right? And anyways, this woman was living in a very violent very violent community. Her father, who was fair-skinned enough to pass for white, was doing so to take care of his family. When he was outed as being, you know, colored, they banished him from the state, and he had to move to Florida with their oldest child, who was only 4 years old at the time, a little boy. And then here this woman is, my direct great-great-great-great-grandmother, Rose, was left with all these kids, you know? And so Rose is like going from this semi-comfortable life to this, you know, life of a basically domestic servant that was having to work for white folks. And she had a bad experience with one of the white folks and was like, I'll never again work for another cracker in my life. This was her words. This is what was repeated every day when I was coming up. Treat them that well. And so Almidi, who was this little pretty little fast girl, at least that's what was passed down. I found that that was not the case. Some old white man got a hold to her and claimed he fell in love with her. They have 2 children together. And of course, that white man ends up marrying a white woman. And while he like somewhat supported those kids, he didn't want nothing to do with Momidi, because Momidi is what we call her. But all that being said, then she, you know, after the heartbreak, after the disappointment, she goes through it again. And then she was like, you know what, to hell with everybody, because the Black folks in the community was talking about her. She was a little whore, you know, they weren't part of any kind of religious community. And so they were ostracized in many ways. And so she started sleeping with whoever she could, who was going to provide for whatever needs she had in the moment. And so a lot of the people in her immediate community, she slept with everybody's husband, okay? She slept with people who was related to each other. She didn't care. And she had babies for all of them, didn't raise one. And so our family passed on this very harmful narrative about her. But my mom actually celebrated her. My grandmother kind of celebrated her in ways, because it was this kind of, by the time I was coming up, there was no shame in that. My mom was never married to anyone that she had children with. My grandmother, you know, had 7 marriages and so on and so forth. And so that tabooness of it had kind of ran out. But at the same time, they still did not venerate her in a way that was kind to her being. Nobody really tried to understand her story. But when I found this proof, this evidence of what she went through, I was like, oh shit, this is kind of where it came from. So her relationship with her daughter was very vindictive, they said harmful things to each other. And that tradition kind of passed on all the way to 1962 when my mother was born, to 1989 when my older sister was born, and to this day. And you know, I grew up seeing that and witnessing that violence, witnessing that harm between all these women, and in turn, the world around them. And even though they loved each other deeply and they are all each other's best friends, every generation, the harm that was there was very present. And so I got to witness my mom's depression. I got to witness my mom's addiction. I got to witness all of that, and especially the way that her family treated her. My mom is very dark skinned. And when you go through this, you know, this kind of evolution from being these fair skinned mixed race people all the way to a woman who is half African and is the darkest in her entire family, you know, you got all the things, right? All the colorism, all the violence. And so when I started to kind of explore that and talk to the various, especially the women in my lineage, again, I was raised by my grandparents and great-grandparents. I lost my last great-grandmother in 2018. And so I got to spend a lot of time with all of them. But when I would talk to them about that, how they treated each other, where that came from, what they remembered about these people, what they loved about these people, and then start to ask them about these specific moments, these specific historic moments that shifted things, you know, all these channels opened up. And part of that was through the research, through, you know, naming these people by name, saying their birthdays, celebrating the days that they were born, celebrating the days that they were married, even if it was 100 years later. And also making sure that I shared the information with everybody in my community. That was the big thing, was that when other folks, it didn't matter how old or young they were, when they would hear or relate to something in our lineage, it would kind of open up these very reparative channels, basically, that really just took things by storm. But also because I also grew up in the Hoodoo and Rootwork tradition, I was doing some of the ancestral healing to make sure that these ancestors knew that at least somebody remembered them, somebody cared enough. And I believe that they've always had this deep connection with me as well. And so through that, I feel like I was also able to start healing those lineages. But everybody is not in this work, right? Everybody don't need to be in this work, to be honest. But as far as just genealogy on the basic surface level for Black people, the way it can repair, with right now with the use of DNA to connect with relatives. For a lot of folks, there's a lot of, like we said earlier, there's a lot of people that have paw not paw situations. It could be recent or it can be old, right? There's a lot of situations where people are just, adopted and just want to know and connect with their biological people to know that part of their story. There's also tons of ways where we can reconstruct those families to have them actually at least have that understanding. Now, whatever comes of that is up to the ancestors and up to them in whatever healing stage they're at. But at the same time, that's something that can be done with this. But then on top of that, there's also very physical and real, tangible ways that we can use this stuff. Land is a big thing. For the majority of African Americans, right? Most of us will have ancestry, at least in the last 3 to 4 generations in the South, from the upper South all the way to the deep South. Most of our people would have been agricultural, whether they were sharecropping or whether they actually owned the property that they lived on. And so between 1920 and 1950, the purchase of Black land plummeted in these specific areas. It literally just plummets. Every other group that was, legally able to purchase property, their property ownership skyrockets basically, or at least some other communities it kind of trickles, but nonetheless, ours is the only one that has continuously gone down. And then that also is in urban environments as well during the Great Migration. The reason why I bring this up though, is that as that property purchasing is also going down, property loss is skyrocketing for us. And so lands, especially for us, because I know that this is a spiritual community, we know how important land is to our spiritual practice, be it being what we eat, be it the herbs that we use to heal, be it the material that we use to worship, the material that we use to venerate. Land is so important, right? And so being ripped from that, having that taken from us is very damaging, right? And so with a lot of the work that I do, one big thing that I always track down is exactly the physical locations that our people live. Not just a town, not just a county, but the exact physical places that they were living, working, and loving, and breathing, and hurting, and whatever else they were going through, right? How do we track that? How do we make sure that maybe in that document, in that small clause, there's something that can redeem that for you and your people, right? There's something that we can do. And so I've successfully worked on a couple land restoration courses or cases. That's probably one of my biggest claims to my fame, really is helping people get that property back. Sometimes it's not what you think it's going to be. If your great grand roach bought 40 acres and a mule, 40 acres between descendants of somebody who lived over 100 years ago, that's not a lot to split between a lot of people, right? So there's all these kind of nuances, but at the same time, that's one of the main ways that we can use this work to heal. Also, again, just in the sense of oppression, systemic oppression in this country, for folks that, may have, just gone missing, for folks that were victims of very hateful and violent crimes in the South or elsewhere. One of the biggest things that we've been doing, I have an episode with a collective that I'm part of called Black Pro Gen Live. You can watch it on YouTube for free. There's hundreds of episodes. We have a two-part episode where we talk about lynching victims. And we not only just talk about, oh, so-and-so, John Brown was lynched in Mississippi, but we talk about who John Brown was, who his people were, what the actual circumstances of that lynching was, and then where, where the people who actually did this crime were. A lot of people are still living, believe it or not, who are part of those things, right? Who witnessed that shit, who stood there and took the picture and posed with the body, right? So those are some things that we do, and to use genealogy as a restorative justice means, right? Actually, even if people have been long gone, still being able to say their names and get that clarity. There's families, especially, I have deep roots in Louisiana and Alabama, but in New Orleans in particular, there are families in New Orleans who just been through the ringer in every generation. There's a very, very unknown case of people, about 50 pretty young Black people went missing one day in the 20s in New Orleans. And anyways, they were basically kidnapped and they were taken up to, I want to say, to Idaho, I believe, somewhere where they were basically forced to work in mines. And they got them on basically loitering and vagrancy clauses. And so they shipped them up to enslave these people up to the 1940s. They gave them, you know, serial numbers and all this stuff. And so right around the 1940s, some of their contracts were up. And so these people come out, many of them have like crazy health issues, they have memory loss, they don't know their names, they're put into asylums. And so I was able to track down a bunch of these people by accident, literally by accident. I came across a record that alluded to some of them. And I was like, that don't make sense. And so I started to track these people down and I found out that it was over 50 people taken. And so I started to reach out to those family members. Many of them were living and witnessed the disappearance, right? To at least give them that clarity. One of the folks had only died a year before I found this document. And she was like one of the last people. And this is women and men, right? And so that's the way that we can heal, because stuff like that, we don't get, our folks have lived without some answers, without some clarity, right? So those are some of the, that's some of the ways that I feel like I just talked a lot, but that's some of the main ways that we can heal with this stuff. Just some of, those are just some examples, you know?
Yes, though that, whew, there are many examples. I'm so glad you brought in the idea of land and ownership, reclaiming our knowledge of those, just even knowing that they're, that we're entitled, that we are entitled to something can be healing. But the names, the stories, bridging the gap in any way that we can, beautiful. Thank you so much for providing all those, and congratulations on that. That's a big deal.
Thank you.
That's a big deal. You, looking 23 generations into the future, you've changed a family's trajectory.
We pray and we hope for that. We pray and we hope for that, truly.
Ashe, Ashe. So what we're gonna do now, a couple questions came in. I'm gonna ask those questions and we're gonna open up the space for a short Q&A, and then we're gonna close out. How's that sound?
Cool with me.
Okay, so the first question that came up, I guess it's a very simple question. Where do we start? Outside of asking elder family members, the person who asked this question specified that, where can we start in terms of getting these names, getting these stories, and preparing ourselves to deepen our ancestral work that way?
I love that. So what I tell everybody is, of course, you know, start with yourself, ask the people that you, that are living, or the people that knew your folks. A lot of times, like somebody had mentioned, you know, that the way that our families are structured don't mirror European and legal centric terms of family, right? And relationships. So the people that went to church with your folks, the people that lived in the hood with your folks, the people who went to school with your people, the people that said, I ain't seen you since you was, you know, knee high to a grasshopper. Those are the people that you also can talk to, right? Just to say, you know, did my mama have anybody that she was dating that you know about? Did grandmama so-and-so live on 6th Street and not 10th? Those are things to consider. Did you ever notice if they cooked gumbo on Christmas or did they eat steak and lobster? Like, those are specific things. So you know at least a direction that you're looking for. But then after that, the best thing that you can do is to turn to the internet. Ancestry is not a free website. But they do offer a little trial. I tell people all the time, like, unless you really are obsessed with genealogy and want to do it professionally, do not pay all that money for Ancestry unless you really are starting to like gain some traction. Otherwise, do not worry about it. But familysearch.org is another website that's very reliable. I suggest not making your family tree on Family Search, just because that's the Mormons' owned website. And when you add a family tree to Family Search, they baptize your ancestors. Now, I don't believe, okay, I see y'all reaction, so I can, if y'all want, I can talk about that, but for time's sake, you know, it's up to y'all.
We'll circle back around to that. We'll circle back around.
Cool. So cool. So anyways, but Family Search has, in essence, more records and material than Ancestry has, especially pretty much from all over the world. But it's a little less user-friendly. And so that's the thing to worry about. But specifically, what I would do is you can go to Ancestry or Family Search. Also a cool website called newspaper.com and Genealogy Bank. Those two places are really good because they will have information literally coming up to the present of newspaper mentions of you, your family, your teachers, whoever is of interest in your research. Typically, there's going to be something on there about them, depending on where they were and when. But online, just using Ancestry and Family Search, working your way from yourself, looking up if you were born in California, Texas, there's a couple states. I think just California and Texas are the first ones that come to mind that literally has a birth record index up to like 97. And so if you're like me and you was born in California before then, your birth record is going to be on there and it'll have your mother's maiden name, your birthday, and what county you were born in, which is actually, you know, kind of makes you raise your eyebrows. Why is this available? But for Texas, it'll actually mention both of your parents' full names, right? And so like, say for instance, if you're adopted, sometimes those records might mistakenly have not been sealed. So that's one possibility. But nonetheless, just see first what is on the internet, what is in these documents about yourself, so you can get an idea of what records actually look like. Do that with your parents. Most of our parents will have like, you know, phone book addresses and so on and so forth that you can use. You know, my mama, if I found a phone book address and my mom was living in Oak Park, I'd be like, Mom, what was you doing in Oak Park in 97 when I grew up in East Sac? That don't make no sense. Or why is this phone book, why is this you know, this address in my name and not yours, right? Those are things to keep in mind that like our ancestors do. Our ancestors have always done. And then keep it going. Typically by our grandparents' ages, you know, for most of us, and you know, for most millennials at least, our grandparents are going to be born anywhere between, you know, as late as like the late 40s, maybe even early 50s, and as early as, you know, maybe 1920, right? Those people are all going to be recorded on census records. So think about it. If you're from, think about where you're from, think about where your parents are from. So I knew growing up that my mama and my grandmother was from Alabama. So I had to think, okay, at what point does my grandmother come to California, right? So work your way back, make a timeline and say, okay, if I knew grandmama was in, you know, Oakland by 1956, the last census that's available for actually just for a couple months, the 1950 census comes out. Some of y'all parents might be on there, some of y'all grandparents may be on there, whatever. But all that being said, if I knew that the last census that came out was the 1940, I would be like, okay, my grandma was born in 1938. She was in Alabama. She would have been 2 years old. So I need to look up her name in Alabama at that time. If you don't know that much detail, if maybe grandmama is dead and you never got to ask her about who her parents were, or you don't have an obituary or whatever, try to find at least her death index or her death record. That'll say at least a year to help you go in the right direction, a state to go in the right direction. And you kind of just keep building from there. Those records will start to say, you know, the various relationships, ages, birthplaces, so on and so forth. But once you get to that point, especially when you get back to wherever home is for your people, I want you not to just look at your own ancestors. If there's a census page that you find, look at all the people living nearby. Take stock of how old they are. Take stock of their race in particular. If you see they're all listed as Negro, 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 you know that they were in a specific location that was segregated and that's why they lived there, right? If you notice that they're all listed as farm labor, farm labor, farm labor, farm labor is not the equivalent of farmer, right? So that means that they were sharecropping, right? Look to see if they were literate or illiterate. It'll say can read and write, can speak English. look and see that. Look and see who, if the parents can't read and write, see if their kids can. If the grandparents can't read and write, see where the family was, right? So those are some important things. Don't just look only at your own individual family, because that's where we go blind. Our ancestors never lived in isolation. Our ancestors always put their roots down and had to connect and collaborate with each other, and their relationships, their kinfolks, their networks were the most important thing to them. Try to look up an old map of the place that you're at. Typically what I do is I will just Google, so my family's from Connecticut County, Alabama. I challenge you all to do this. Look up Connecticut County, Alabama, county map. Get a sense of the land, get a sense of where they were. If you have a census record, usually it will say beat so-and-so or beat 10, whatever. And so you can look on that map and try to look up and find where beat 10 is. It might have an entirely different name today, right? My people are from Owasso, but that place, my family had been there before, but that place was not called Owasso back in the day, it was called Gravilla. And then at one point it was called Lieffian. That's entirely different, right? And so if I'm trying to learn about them, I have to start speaking in between all these different lines and, names for various people, for places, and so on and so forth, and kind of continue your way back. Also, I think it's very important to both have a specific goal, so a lot of us are like, okay, I want to trace my ancestry back to Africa. That's all of our desire, even if we don't say it. Something that's really important to know is that that's possible, right? I know that y'all have probably been told that is impossible. It is possible. I've done it on several lines of my own family, and so has plenty of other people. It is possible, but it might not happen right when you sit down at that desk to start doing this research. Keep in mind that you're going to be doing this for a very long time, unless somebody like me has done it for you. Even then, it's still going to take a minute. And then also keep yourself open. Black families and Black family histories all did not move the same exact way. They did not all do the same things. Some people might, you might just click a link and find out that your people are actually from Honduras and got sent up here, or that your people actually, was free people of color. You might find out that your people even own slaves themselves, right? And so those are some very specific things to keep in mind, that this stuff is going to throw you for a loop. You might find that one of your ancestors did something incredible that if you saw somebody doing that today, you would put that motherfucker in your shoe, okay? So these are very, very specific things to keep in mind, right? And so, that is pretty much where you start, fortifying yourself and making sure that after every time you sit down and research, as soon as you get up from that, you wash that shit off. That is the key to it.
I know that's right. Range off. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. Oh, somebody wants to know what the YouTube video channel you mentioned was earlier.
I will put it in the chat. It's called Black Progen Live. Okay. At the moment, the show is on a hiatus. The pandemic really threw a lot for a loop, and also the creator, who's actually a very, very beautiful and powerful Black woman named Nika Sewell Smith. She's my big sister in many ways. She has moved on to a bunch of other projects and other things. And so she was the main one coordinating the show. And so the show is kind of on pause right now, but that page still does produce content. We share a bunch of other things on there, other programs, but there's tons of episodes of all kinds of topics. We have topics based on states, based on specific regions, based on certain circumstances. Like I keep saying, paw not paw, we literally have an episode about paw not paw and how to handle that, how to navigate that. We have an episode about how to interview your people, how to interview your community. We have an ancestor about self-care in this work. We have an episode about researching slavery, but also episodes about researching specific kinds of slavery. We have episodes about Puerto Rico, Haiti, Jamaica. You ask for it, it's probably on there. And then even sometimes, because all of these things are so interconnected, in any individual episode, we'll also be talking about other connected topics as well. So it's important to just check it out. Sometimes, especially when we first started the show, sometimes the episodes could go as long as 2 hours. We kind of figured out how to get the handle of that. But, you know, if you got time, if you want to listen to it as a podcast, whatever, you know, you can definitely, it's worth tuning into.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, that makes so much sense for it to end up being 2 hours. I mean, anybody who has taken this class knows that this shit goes for hours and hours after it's over. But it's important for us to make space for the things that are so important. What's more important than this right now? So even this class went over, this conversation went over, but we can make time for what is important, and practicing being in this space for an extended amount of time to get the information that feeds your soul is something that we need to work on anyway. So I will be checking out that channel for sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have one more question, and then we're going to open up the space for Q&A. Diane asks, what's the best way to connect with and verify information about ancestors whose names you do not know? At an ancestor altar or another method? And before you answer, the best way to verify information about an ancestor, it can happen at the altar and in addition to another method. They do not have to be mutually exclusive.
They shouldn't be. To be honest, if you're, you know, for this work, I don't think that they should be exclusive at all. I think that that's a really beautiful question, and really glad that somebody asked. Part of it is, so for instance, most of us did not know our ancestors, right? Most of us won't know our ancestors until we cross over, or whatever practice you believe in. But the way that we verify it is we kind of have this system where 2 + 2 = 4, right? And so with our people, if we have, you know, for a lot of our folks were oftentimes illiterate, so they didn't always know the exact spelling of names, or somebody else spelled what they heard, right? And so on a lot of records and a lot of the material that we use, it's going to kind of vary from place to place. It does not change the name. It does not change the person's identity whatsoever. However, you have to take, you know, kind of into consideration that and say, okay, if this is Charlie Hawthorne, I'm speaking for one of my great-great-grandfathers. If this is Charlie Hawthorne, I know that this record in 1910 said he was 40 years old. This record in 1920 said he was 58 years old. And then this record in 1930 said he was, you know, 60 years old, whatever. I'm gonna say, okay, at least by this point, he was born about, you know, 18 something, right? At least in this decade. Now, when we can get to the specific dates, that's when we kind of go further back and use other material to support or disprove material that you found elsewhere. Also, you know, if you have an oral story or oral history about your family, if there's even just, you know, my people, if somebody in your family said, oh yeah, our family is from, you know, South Carolina, that's an oral history right there. But if you find a document that says that they're from Virginia, but you knew that you grew up talking to your family in South Carolina, that document probably is not your people, right? So if there's a Charlie Hawthorne, if there's 17 Charlie Hawthornes, I know my Charlie Hawthorne from South Carolina, but there's 3 of them is in Mississippi, 2 of them in Alabama, 1 of them in Chicago. Which one do you think is actually going to be yours? Really use that discernment, right? And also see if it matches the information that you know about your family, specifically immediate families. That's one of the biggest things that Ancestry, Family Search, and all of these companies do not do. Another thing that I will say is, no matter what you do, do not base your family history on anybody else's family tree that you find on the internet. Do not do that. 9 times out of 10, it's people that have never even sat in a class like this to talk with somebody who knows how to do this stuff. It's oftentimes people who, just like us, are just, you know, really thirsty to learn this information, and they start clicking, and they probably clicked and saved stuff from somebody else's tree. And so you got a lot of people that will start believing, you know, that these are parts of their family histories, and it's not true whatsoever. And it actually really is harmful for the bigger picture, because there's all kinds of ways that it can muddle up information. Do not, when you're first starting, do not pay attention to other people's family trees. I promise you that will be the biggest thing to help you. Like, literally, you can turn those options off. But that's how you verify. If you get, one document that you know for sure is your people, look for things that specifically matches that and give it room for a little bit of flexibility, like ages, especially when we go further back. Former enslaved people oftentimes did not know the exact year that they were born. They based it on natural occurrences or big life events. I plan today to talk to y'all about something that I think would be really important for folks in the Rootwork and Hoodoo community in particular. There's a time period, there was a night that a lot of folks all over the South said that it was the night that the stars fell. It was a very important moment in Black history that is not really talked about a lot. But our people based their ages and their historic memory based on that night. And so if you guys look up the night the stars fell plus the Leonid meteor shower, y'all will be blown away, I promise you. This was basically a meteor shower that was so profound and so like close to home that people really thought that the world was ending. Folks got freed that night because the white folks was like, Jesus and came back. I gotta let these niggas go. Basically, I gotta get right. Some people finally went inside a home for the first time that day. Some people escaped that day. Some people, I have an ancestor who's a set of twins who were born as soon as the stars stopped falling. And so we got to know their exact birthday because of that, right? But they just knew it was the night that the stars fell, and that was passed down to me, right? So these are very important things, but other folks would be like, I was about 10 the night the stars fell, but they were actually 8 years old, right? Or I was already old enough to be in the field that night, so I was grown. Like, those kind of things will impact. And so you're going to find people with these various ages. Also, a lot of the people who are working as government officials recording information, then people was also a step above illiterate themselves. So they couldn't spell, they couldn't read, they didn't know what they was talking about half the time. And then also sometimes they would be very negligent and just say, okay, we in Alabama, you from Alabama, your mama from Alabama, and your daddy from Alabama. And nobody was from Alabama, right? So those are some things to keep in mind. These records are not always going to be exact from one to the other. Diane, did that? I think that was Diane that asked the question. Did that answer? Is she still here?
She asked it via text, but she definitely replied. She thanked you. Yeah, she thanks you for that. And that was super, yes, definitely. Thank you so much. Super details. I never heard about the night the stars fell.
I really would love, I really think that you will go in when you read about that, hopefully tonight, hopefully soon. I really think that you will just go crazy with that because it is very, very beautiful and profound.
It is, and it's something I'm really, really focusing on lately in terms of my astrological study, is the astrological rituals and connections to the cycles of the sun, moon, and stars that our ancestors who worked the earth at all hours and days of the night had the first eyes on. So uncovering stories about what they saw has been really, really, really important to me lately. I never heard about this. Thank you. So valuable, so valuable. So let's go ahead and open up the Q&A. If you want to, I guess we'll go in order of hands. If you want to put your hand up, I can go ahead and go in order. There were some people that were sending me private messages asking questions. Now, if you want to do that, you can unmute your mic and go for it. The Leonid meteor shower, yes.
While we're waiting, somebody early on mentioned that we're the daughters of the witches they couldn't burn. I wanted to laugh so hard. I don't know who it was, but that is exactly what I'm talking about. Like, that is literally exactly what I'm talking about. I love that. I promise any question that you ask, is absolutely safe and is absolutely fine. I would love, while we're here, to be able to answer anything. If there's anything that you guys want to know, just other tips and tricks, other specific questions. You know, you can ask my mama, my great-great-grandmother was on a census record in 1910. What does this mean? Or, you know, I found blah, blah, blah. What do I do with this? Where do I go next? I would love to answer that with the time that we have. I won't be able to tell you, you know, if your ancestors are talking to you, because that's not my ministry, but.
Okay, Milani, you can go ahead and unmute and going in.
So when it comes to records beyond vital records, what are some of the ones that you explore? For example, my great-great-grandmother, I found out she was a dressmaker. My grandmother never knew this, and she spent so much time with her grandmother. I learned this from like a directory. So I've been trying to think more creatively about the other kinds of records I could be looking at to get some additional information. I've been looking at advertisements from the area, but I was wondering if you had any other input or ideas for that.
That's a brilliant question. So occupations, right? People, especially, was this grandmother Black?
Yeah, she was Black and Muskogee.
Got it. I'm also Muskogee.
Oh, cousins.
There we go. So we really should connect. I have a big Black and Muskogee community to connect you to if you'd like.
I would love that.
Nonetheless, with our folks, occupations can jump from, can be code for a lot of things, okay? How many street pharmacists have you heard about or know, right? That also don't file that on their taxes. And so I ain't coming for your grandma, I promise that's not what I'm doing. But what I am saying is that dressmaker could also, while she was probably making dresses, she could have been hemming clothes, she could have been, you know, just a general seamstress, whatever the case is, and they relegated that to dressmaker. And she could have also been, you know, doing root work on the side, she could have been cutting hair on the side, she could have been doing whatever, right? And so those are some important things to keep in mind. Ways that we find out about employment, just to broaden this a little bit, ways that we find out about employment. So one good thing is using directories and census records to determine what, you know, occupations people will be doing. Sometimes on censuses, they list very generic forms of occupation, you know, farm laborer. Farm laborer can include a ton of things, right? A dressmaker feels more specific, but say for instance, somebody works in a steel mill, right? So say like, so people in like Ohio, Pennsylvania, it's a lot of steel mill work back then, right? And still, how do you know what steel mill they're working for? If you want to know like what materials these people were working with, what, you know, their commute was like, who their bosses were, who were the people they worked with and what were they doing, right? You can look around the community and just try to find like in that year that you find that document, you know, steel mill, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and look and see which ones there are. Then I would go through and try to research that place a little bit more. Oftentimes when we find records of employment, a lot of these companies and corporations, even to the smaller scale, are housed in local archives. They're also housed in universities where they'll literally have like pay rosters of people. For instance, a lot of Black folks descend from Pullman porters, which were basically, you know, men on the railroad trains from the late 1800s all the way to like the 1930s or so. And these are men that basically served people on these trains going across country, and they made pretty good money, right? But the Pullman Porter records are literally held in Chicago, and it shows pay rosters, it shows names of parents, it shows where people lived. Even if I have a great grandfather who was a Pullman Porter, he had women in every city. He would list their addresses when he was stationed at those places. He would list those addresses. That's how I started finding out all his other kids that nobody knew about, right? And I was like, oh, this is how this DNA match is connected to me. But those records are also really, really important. And then just as far as other occupations as well, like even, you know, we don't want to erase the sharecropper experience that I keep saying, like just sharecropper. I think that's a really big job actually. But the way that we find out about that is twofold. They had a lot of times they had legalized documents. Those are going to be held at the county level, right? Between them and the person that owned the property they were on. Sometimes you can just look on a census record and see, and you just look at who the next person is listed as the actual owner of the property. Usually you'll just see an OF in those marks. And then you look down below your ancestors' homes and you see the next person that's listed as the owner of a property. And so you know that it's either, you know, if Mr. Jones is the first one, and then Mr. Brown is the next one, then you know that either Mr. Brown or Mr. Jones's land is who your people were sharecropping on. And then you go into the records around that, right? So those are some of the ways that you do that. Now, as far as dressmaking and like more individualized work, that's a little harder unless like she had a storefront, you know. But other things that you can look up are tax records. Tax records after certain points and also before certain points are typically available again at the county level. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that was extremely helpful, and I've taken lots of notes. Thank you very much.
Glad, I'm really glad.
Any more questions? Teal? Go ahead and unmute.
Hello, can you hear me well?
So we
Yep.
can.
All right, hi everybody. Well, first off, I just want to say, you know, like this learning with you guys, it makes me feel like our ancestors on the other side of the veil hanging out, going, hey, slap hands and let's communicate. We all family up here. Let's make them family down there. So, hi, all my new family on both sides.
Hey,
But
family.
my question is, I found a paper. And it was like a small card, and I'm not really sure how they document the indigenous people, but it just rubbed me the wrong way. It looked like a ticket from like a trinket store, but it says it doesn't claim a name to a person, but it claims that whoever this card belonged to, if it was attached to something, that person was of the, you know, indigenous background and descendants and things. Is that something you've seen before?
Not necessarily. I think I would need to see it to actually know specifically what you're talking about. So like for instance, in Oklahoma, on each, you know, of the 5 like, you know, whitewashed tribes, basically, they have their own nations, right? And so they have their own license plates. They have their own systems of medicine, systems of government, so on and so forth. And they issue IDs, cards, so on and so forth, to people that are registered as members. And that also includes their freedmen descendant, if they recognize their freedmen descendants.
Okay.
And so that's something to keep in mind. But also, just to kind of let me draw back to you, it would depend on the context. If I highly doubt that, you know, so say for instance, if your ancestor just had, if somebody in your family just had that around and it didn't have a name on it, I feel like that's something that I would not consider as law if you do not recall that ancestor having any proximity to any kind of indigenous community. And so, you know, as far as something that we didn't cover, and actually this is the first time that I've ever taught this kind of class or ever been a part of this kind of community where what about my Indian great grandma didn't come up. And I'm really, really thankful for that. And that's not to mention that indigenous people, that Black people do not have indigenous ancestry, right? That's not to discard that. But it is something that often comes up in these spaces because a lot of us were raised with that story and with that belief, and it serves a function. And it's not anything that we're going to shit on our ancestors for passing down, and we're not going to like internalize against ourselves. But something that does happen is that's the first thing that people are after in this work, right? Because they want to answer that. But something that happens with Black folks is that because Black people were owned in many places and in many ways by enslaved people or by Native American people, Black people also were raped by Native American people. Black people also had very lifelong committed partnerships with Native American people, and their descendants and offspring live to this day. However, it's regional, it's circumstantial. And so not everybody is going to fit in that category, and not everybody is going to actually like carry that same kind of experience, and that is absolutely fine. Now, what happens though is that for a lot of Black and Native people, most Black and Native people, especially those that stay in the South, still had some kind of proximity or collaboration with people, either other Black Native people or with the actual natives, even if they're white natives, right? They still typically do have some kind of connection with that. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Having trinkets and charms of Native American identity doesn't necessarily give you proximity to Native American ancestry, or even is a slight indicator. And so we have to just keep that in mind. Now, if there was, which I can probably guarantee you, somebody in this room either was told that they were Native American or know somebody that claims Native American ancestry. That is Black culture. Like, that really is at this point. However, at the same time, somebody in this room, which we already were able to see with, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name, Milani, that is Black and Native, right? And so that's a big possibility. But for people that have that suspicion or that have that story, again, we're not gonna like go against our ancestors or whoever it was that passed on that story and blame them, right? We're gonna explore it and we're gonna look and see where our folks were, right? So if your ancestry, for instance, mine is from Lower Alabama and New Orleans. Now, in my family, I was raised in Muskogee and Black tradition. I was raised on that land. That was what was given to me. That was what was told to me. And I can also document that. But then on another end, if the names in that community did not match any kind of Native identity, it would have been very, very hard for me to prove that. The land that we lived on was called Owasso. That ain't English. You know what I mean? The river that ran through our land is called the Sapoga. That ain't English. So those are specific things. My family worshiped corn until literally the 1990s. Those things are not specific to white culture or specific to, being the full African-American experience that, we all have kind of lived under. So just looking for those kind of signifiers is really, really important. Really take stock of what your family was involved in, who they were connected to. There are plenty of Black folks, like we were talking about earlier, who were not enrolled in their tribes because their tribes were racist too, were anti-Black. And then also, there are plenty of people who have experienced kind of a paper genocide by, destroying records or removing that information. And so you have to like put all of these different pieces together to actually be able to narrow that down. I know that you didn't ask for all that, but I did just want to say that to all of us, because a lot of people, do go down that route and are either disappointed or just have misinformation that they cling to.
That was very helpful to me because, like I said, I inherited all of the old paperwork from generations ago, and when I seen it, I held on to it because it was like a little brown paper that looked like it could have been made in the 30s, so I just held on to it. So that was really clarity for me. I appreciate you.
That's really good. Teal, if you want, at the end, I'll link my contact information, and then also you guys can find me on Facebook as well. If you want, I would love to see the document and be able to point you in the right direction if I can.
Love it. I appreciate you. Sure. Thank you.
Cool.
Cool. Who's next?
I said, is it Twyla or Twila? I'm just trying to see if I'm pronouncing it right. I just saw your message that says that they don't have any oral history of being Native, but it does show up on tests. And I think that that's another important thing, right? Part of it is that DNA tests in general are a mixed bag. So my grandmother shows Native American ancestry, but I don't. On 2 different tests, I don't show it at all. But both of my grandmothers show it, right? One grandmother in a smaller dose and then another grandmother in a higher dose. Either way, that doesn't like substantiate, that doesn't necessarily dismiss me from being Native, but it also doesn't dismiss my grandmothers if I can't trace them either, right? Part of that also to think about is just, again, proximity. So my grandmother, both of my grandmothers have Muskogee ancestry. My paternal grandmother, I specifically says, has Muskogee ancestry because that's it. She just has a Muskogee ancestor, just like she got hella white ancestors. That's it. But she's not white. And she's also in her worldview, she's not Muskogee either. But my maternal grandmother identifies as Black and Muskogee, right? And so like that's the difference. And so like even though they both have this DNA, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean immediately that you are part of XYZ community. Just like I can't go to a lot of these white people house that I got my nose from and say, hey, I'm a Caucasian, give me my Caucasian points. You know what I mean? It's just not gonna happen, right? So those are some specific things. Tracing Native American ancestry also comes with a lot of the same complications as tracing Black ancestry, sometimes even more, because a lot of times they're living outside of
Uh-oh.
mixed bag. I
Yeah.
don't know if everybody's frozen or if it's me. Oh, it's me.
You froze for just a little bit.
Okay, but could you guys hear me?
Yeah, right after you were you're talking about the difficulties in being able to locate ancestral information about your Native American ancestors because they lived oftentimes outside of the structure and the system. Are you there?
I'm still here.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, cool. I will say just on top of that, something to keep in mind, even if you don't have any stories about Native American ancestry or even interest in Native American ancestry, whatever the case is, I think that's something really important when we're also researching our family histories is to know what lands you are on, what lands your families were on. And so I'm not on some, you know, land acknowledgement, acknowledge the natives first type stuff, but it is important in knowing what your family was eating, what languages your family may have heard. So any agricultural practices that even as our families were enslaved, right? So if they're being brought from South Carolina to, you know, Alabama or whatever, right? Any agricultural practices, food traditions in that specific area that your family had been on, if they were there for 2 generations or if they were there for 7, a lot of times, most of what was being done was informed by what natives in that area were already doing. And so being able to look on just simple land, you know, native land maps. I think there's one that's called like nativeland.ca. That's a really good website. And it'll just show the general range of who was there and looking up those things. See if some of the names in your family match up with some things there. See if there's you know, any kind of connection. I think that's really, really, really important. Native Americans were, you know, almost always a hop, skip, and a jump away from where our people were. And either they were teaching them, you know, oh, you sick, like, you know, Sister Sue, your baby got, you know, XYZ, you need this herb. And Sister Sue is like, no, my African grandmama said that I need this herb. And the Native American is like, nah, Sister Sue, like you need this sassafras. I'm trying to tell you. That is how our traditions really start to kick off, especially on that specific regional space. Just keeping that in mind. Even if they were not blood related to these people, even if they were not, you know, even if you don't have any known connection or want to have a connection, you still got to think about who all was there.
Good point. And since we're already kind of talking about the DNA tests, you know, we are in this era where a lot of people are interested in learning more about where they come from. So we're kind of rushing in flocks to these DNA test companies, for better or worse. So I am curious, there's a lot of kind of mixed information about the science related to taking an ancestry test and getting these different percentages back about your ethnic groups. So I guess the question is 2 parts. Should we be trusting them companies? You know, do they have our best interests in heart? Is there anything that we should be aware of before moving into them? And what are your thoughts on African ancestry in particular?
1, don't use African ancestry, save your money.
Ooh.
I hate to hate on that. I hate to hate on that sister. I hate to hate on her. But that test is not accurate. It is just not accurate, and it does not do anything for you. It does not tell you a story about your family whatsoever. It really sucks. And if anybody has taken that test, I apologize for, just kind of dropping that on you, because it is the most expensive test of all of them.
Yeah.
But it is not accurate whatsoever, and it doesn't have any function. All they do is mail you a piece of paper that says you are, your direct either paternal or maternal ancestry is from a specific community, and oftentimes it is very, very wrong. In fact, in 2020, there was a pretty good reveal about the accuracy of their tests, and it really is sad because you want to support your own. This is from DC that started that company over 10 years ago, but it is not accurate. As far as the question of, do they have our best interests at heart? No corporation has our best interests at heart. So you have to keep that in mind, right? But I will say that the safest company to use, the specific safest company to use would be Ancestry. For more scientific results like haplogroups, for anybody that's unfamiliar with haplogroups are basically the way that the human genome is broken down based on population and community. So your direct, most ancient ancestors that had genes that mutated away from other environments and other groups will have a specific haplogroup. We all do. And so for women can only trace their direct maternal haplogroup because it traces through the X chromosome. Men can trace both the X and the Y chromosome, which would go to their most direct male ancestor, and then also to their direct most ancient female ancestor. And so for most Black folks, most of us will have a direct female ancestor from West Africa or West and Central Africa. But a lot of our direct, and this is also a regional complication too, a lot of our direct ancestors will be white men, and we can kind of infer why, right? And so African ancestry, one of the issues with it is that it only gives a certificate about that. But for instance, with 23andMe, you actually get to get both of those results. You get to get the haplogroups. You get to see who all else had that haplogroup, who shares those haplogroups, what significant things are about that haplogroup, and exactly where and when it most likely kind of sprung up. And so it's a little more scientific. You also get information on both of them, on Ancestry and 23andMe, that shows who you're related to. And so that's something that's really powerful for Black genealogy, because again, we have all of these nuances in the way that our families are structured. But part of the big thing, if you were a descendant of slavery in America, having a DNA test is a huge tool for your family history once you're at the point where you can successfully research your own family. And part of that is because so many of our people, there's no one living today who is of African-American descent, descendants of slavery, whatever you want to call us, that does not have separation that occurred in your family, in your lineage. Somebody's sister was taken to Virginia, somebody's sister was taken to Alabama. It's just, that's fact. And so in those DNA matches, you're gonna see every last person who took the test that shares any ancestry with you. And it's gonna show the degree of that relationship. And also it's gonna show who all shares that same ancestry with you and that person. And so what we do is we do a thing called triangulation, where we narrow down, what we try at least to narrow down who the common ancestor is between you, that person, and some of these other people. And it's a really, really time, considerate task, but it's very powerful in repairing the bonds that were separated during slavery. As far as the safety of those companies, the reason why I refer to Ancestry and 23andMe, Ancestry is the only commercial DNA company that has specifically put it in writing that they will not, even if the courts, if the courts issue a warrant to access your data, they will not give it, and they cannot give it, and they're protected by the law not to give that. And so they've committed to that. Now, if you download, every DNA test has the option to download your what's called raw DNA data. And so you can download that data and you can put it into other websites and other databases. And there's like all these different tools and so on and so forth. But anytime you do something with a third party, right, you don't really have any control over what they do with it, because they're not going to have the same contract that you and Ancestry have when you submit that test. And so Ancestry has committed to that. You also can have the option to have your actual DNA sample destroyed after its process. And so, I mean, none of us know what happens in that lab, right? But we want to at least assume that for once the legal system is there. But nonetheless, you know, that's kind of the way that that process works. Now, the data will still be there, but the DNA sample itself will be destroyed, and they can't plant it on anything to, you know, whatever. They can't give it to anybody else. 23andMe is a little more specific, and so they will have options like, do you want this to be part of a scientific study to learn about, you know, Black people with sickle cell, you know, genes, or do you want to, you know, be part of a COVID study to see if you guys might be resistant to COVID, or what, you know, allergies, medicine responses you guys might have, what, you know, health conditions might run in your family, all those kinds of things. And 23andMe did get FDA approval a few years ago to do this like health analysis. And it, you know, you can kind of, again, take it with a grain of salt. Like if it says cancer run in your family, that don't mean you're gonna die of cancer, right? So those are some things just to keep in mind. As far as their privacy goes, they do have a stronger privacy system, but I will say that a big thing that I will tell y'all to do, there's a website, and I'm actually when we wrap up, I'm gonna tell you guys some next steps that you guys can do to be involved. But there's a website that is really, really popular, and it's called GEDmatch, GED match. And don't put it in a link. Don't put it in a link, Daisy. So I'm a very big advocate against GEDmatch and what they about. Primarily because GEDmatch started as basically like a hobbyist genealogy website. And it had all these different tools that you could use. After you download your raw DNA data, you can upload it to GEDmatch. And so if you take a test on Ancestry.com and you know you have a biological twin that takes a test on 23andMe, you guys aren't going to see each other's results on, you know, those individual platforms. You'll only see your result, they'll only see their result, even though you guys are related, because they have their separate databases, separate platforms, right? So what GEDmatch basically sought to do was to put all of these different DNA tests, because there's a bunch of them around the web, right? To put them all in one place. And the power of that is that you get to see, you know, all the other people that you're related to, find out more specifically how you're related. And that's really, that in theory, that's really powerful. But what ends up happening is GEDmatch started to contract with the feds. And so we know the history of criminality and incarceration, especially as it impacts Black people. And so what happens is, I know there was a couple of people that said that they was from the Bay or familiar with the Bay, but we had somebody called the Golden Gate Killer or Golden State Killer from the 60s through the 70s. And this man killed up a bunch of people, a serial killer. And he went uncaught for 40, 50 years, basically. The way that they found him first, what they did was he got sloppy in one of his murders and left a little bit of DNA at the site. And they basically took that DNA and created a profile on GEDmatch with it to see who all it matched. And then they took the people that they matched and they made family trees of all these people. Now, I'm gonna just give y'all a spoiler. This man ended up being an old ass white man who was just here in the Bay Area living his life. But what they did was, and they had to assume that the killer lived in the Bay Area. They knew that. They knew that he had to be between a specific age. They knew that he was male. But what they did was they created all these family trees, and they had to create a pretty big family tree. One of the people, a Black person, had, you know, uploaded to GEDmatch, and this was a Black person, like most Black people, have at least some white ancestry that comes down in all kinds of different ways, right? And in all kinds of different degrees. And so just because, you know, you have white ancestry, that also means you got white ass relatives that you don't know nothing about, and they most likely don't know nothing about you. The relationship could be 200 years older, it could be 2 days older, it don't matter. But anyways, a Black person innocently researching their family history, collaborating with other people, uploaded this to GEDmatch. They had their public family tree available. The feds, you know, figured out how they were related to these other white folks and other people that took the test. And they were like, this is our guy. And it was a Black man here in Richmond, California. And if y'all know about Richmond, then you really know what's up right now. But anyways, he was in Richmond, and this is a Black man in his 70s who was already really poor, a veteran, and had PT. They raid this man's house and arrest him, and they hold him on charges of suspicion of being the Golden Gate Killer. They swiftly found out that that was not him when he did not match specifically that DNA profile. But what they were able to find was that they were definitely cousins. This man ain't know nothing about the white man that raped his grandmama or nothing. Like, he didn't know nothing about this, have nothing to do with it. And so anyways, years later, it takes them about 2 more years. I think about 2016 is when they actually caught the real killer here in the Bay Area. And after that, they saw the success of that. And so they started to contract with the feds even more. Now, as soon as that happened, all of the like larger names in Black genealogy immediately was like, oh no, like pull your kits down, delete your profile, do not consent to this. Afterwards, GEDmatch was like, well, you can have the option to consent or to not. But they still submitted everybody's DNA test to this project. So it was a complete lie. And afterwards, there are several cases, my DNA included, where they created a fake copy of my own DNA profile. And the only reason why I knew it was mine was because somebody closely related to me matched it and was like, oh, I'm trying to figure out who this AT person is, even though I had deleted my profile and deleted everything from it, deleted the DNA sample and everything. And so that is not something that I encourage any of us to participate in. Unfortunately, there is a huge amount of Black people that are just like, we need GEDmatch, it's the only way. It's not the only way. I am perfectly fine and safe without using it. It has never done anything life-changing for me, but I know for other people, it can be a resource, especially those that are, trying to find and narrow down unknown, recent family relationships. I get it, but at the same time, it's not worth it. In theory, people are like, oh, well, they're solving violent crimes. The violent crimes against Black people that have gone unsolved have never been used in these cases. So we can see what it's about, right? Almost every person that they've arrested or discovered and found have largely been Black men, okay? And that's not to say that even if these Black men did some of these crimes, that's not to say that I want to be part of their incarceration or that I want my simply looking for my family history to be part of that, especially if these is Black folks that I'm kin to that I don't even know half the time. So I warn you guys about that. But those are the main things that you should avoid if you whatever moral compass you walk.
Woo, that is critical information as we move into this kind of new age of interesting types of surveillance and law enforcement becoming more involved in our everyday moments and thoughts via social media, via different types of surveillance. Who knew they could do DNA surveillance with these companies, and who knew these companies were collaborating with them like that? That is super important information.
When Ancestry released that statement that they would not submit it, it was directly in response to that. And so Ancestry actually did get proactive with being like, look, now we ain't gonna give y'all stuff away. And so I would like to trust that. Otherwise, they would have a really fat class action lawsuit. They're one of the wealthiest companies in the country right now. So, that I still encourage people to use Ancestry, if anything.
Okay, thank you. And that's a relief too, because I did use Ancestry, and the family tree function and the kind of blood testing function have been really helpful in getting some answers. But I am also encouraged quite a bit to go to the GEDmatch. And I just never have. But that's good to know moving forward. Yeah. Oh, any other questions? I know there was something you were mentioning about not creating your family tree on a specific website to avoid all of your family being baptized into the Mormon church. Please say more.
Okay, so the reason why the Mormon church, so by the way, Ancestry also was started by Mormon people, by the way. So we ain't gonna exempt them, but it is not an entity of the church. And the information on there does not get baptized the way that it would on Family Search. So Family Search is specifically ran by the Mormon church. The reason why the Mormons have such an interest in genealogy. So if you know about the history of the Latter-day Saints, they only started around the 1840s or so. And nobody in the world was feeling their religion. Like they was like, oh nah, hell nah. This, like you can be as Protestant as you want to be. You can be whatever you want to be as far as religious freedom goes, but this some bullshit. And it was basically a form of one, tax evasion, but also, you know, for folks that was like, I'm really trying to get into this polygamy wave. And so this is what I'm about. We're gonna make a religion out of this. And so it was a bunch of white guys that basically did that. You know, and again, like not trying to discount anybody's spirituality or whatever, but that is kind of the way that religion was conceived. And so they get chased, their asses get chased all the way across the country because they were specifically breaking, you know, laws, even as white people. You know that the laws had to be that bad for them to chase white people all the way across the country, right? And then they kill up a bunch of Native Americans on the way, the Mormons do. And so all that being said, in order for this country to respect, at that point, to respect and recognize a religious institution or a religious entity, you had to, one, have a specific amount of people who were part of that religion. Now, this is, I mean, it's not the smallest band of people, but it's not enough people to be recognized as a religion at that time. And so the way that they started to do about 50 years into the history of the Mormon Church, they were like, well, what if we baptize all of our family into the church? And then also, as we start to evangelize, what if we baptize all of those people and their ancestors into the church? So that way they can have salvation in heaven, even if they did not receive the teachings of Mormon. And so it's called baptism by proxy. And I promise I'm not trying to be superstitious or messy. This is the history of this church. And so they started this process called baptism by proxy. And so what they used after the Mormon church was accepted, you know, because they're white folks, right? They ain't gonna do much, you ain't gonna hate white people for too long in this country. And so by the early 1900s, the Mormons had already, you know, began to expand outside of Utah. They had gone to other places. But what they started to do was really launch this missionary, you know, zeal to go and spread the word of Mormonism, but most specifically to get people, when you join the Mormon church today, if you join the Mormon church, you have to research your family history as much as you possibly can. And so you have to do it. And so that's the purpose why they have these family history centers that I mentioned at the beginning around the country. They want their new folks to go in and do that. And then you do your mission and all this other stuff. But the reason why they want that is because if they baptize everybody's ancestors, then, you know, they can say that their membership is that high. At this point, because they've baptized so many people, living people into the church, they now have, you know, for every living person, I mean, hell, we have 8 great-grandparents, 16 greats, 24, you know, all that. And so, you know, if you think about one person being baptized and you really take their entire lineage, that's enough to have that status recognized. And so they are a really large institution now. They are one of the most colonial institutions at this point. If anybody has the opportunity or has had the opportunity to go to Hawaii, to go to anywhere in Polynesia, that is the largest religious institution, particularly of, you know, natives there on all of those islands. And they basically enslaved people to work on, like, the Dole plantation also was owned by the Mormons. And so they would be like, okay, well, we'll educate you if you work in these. We'll feed you if you work in these, because now we control the entire food system of this, you know, of this region and of this community. And so it's very, very violent, very, very, very white supremacist. But by the 80s, they started to shift their politics around Blackness in particular. They were one of the main people that were proponents of, you know, the myth of the Mark of Cain, or the Mark of Ham, rather, about Black people. So Black people were not allowed inside of the temples. Even if Black people were attached to the Mormon church, they were not allowed to hold any kind of priesthood most of the time. And so they were a very, very anti-Black institution, but now their Black numbers are growing. And, you know, whatever, on an individual level, I don't care. But when it comes to the information that you place in there, they basically claim ownership of it and of your ancestors. And I believe that I don't know what they do when they baptize, what baptism by proxy, like what the actual ritual looks like. But I would prefer to keep my ancestors out of that. I'm like, I can't imagine my ancestors easily being baptized by proxy by a bunch of folks that they wouldn't have liked anyways. So that's
virtual baptism. Who ever heard of such a thing?
Yeah, and it's been going on for a very long time, And you can't delete, you can't delete the information from there. And so it's so bad to the point where in the early 2000s, the Catholic Church, the Vatican literally ordered for them to not ever be able to access Catholic records, because what they were doing was they particularly in the Americas, they would get all of the Catholic Church diocese records. So these are baptism, marriages, and burials, and they would digitize them and film them. And then they would take them back to the temple, and they would just scan through these and baptize everybody by proxy, everybody in these books. And the like, hell nah. And if the Vatican, I mean, if the Catholic Church is on that, then you know something wrong, right? So, just keeping that in mind, especially for those of you guys that are trying to do ancestral healing work, I just would recommend that those are not routes that you take. Protect your ancestors' names, collaborate with your people, learn more about your ancestors also through the rest of your kin in the diaspora, but protect them. That is something that is very important. Do not let anybody else write the narrative for your people. Let your ancestors speak to you. Let them speak to you through these records. Let them speak to you through spirit. But do not just give their identities over to anybody. I really do recommend that. Protect yourself in this as well.
Thank you so much. Wow, I had no idea it would get this deep. I didn't realize that genealogy is such it coming from the minds of eugenicists and colonizers, having created all of these different like branches and tentacles of colonization everywhere, like to the point where we have to be careful about where we do our family research to avoid a virtual retroactive ancestral baptism. That's some like that sounds like some sci-fi movie shit.
It does. It really does. It really does. I will say that you can use their resources without giving them your information. But a lot of them, I don't know where everybody on this call is, but I grew up in California mostly. And so like even here at the Oakland Family History Center, which is one of the larger family history centers on the West Coast, it has this beautiful view overlooking the Bay Area, and the equipment there is state of the art now. However, when I walk in, even though these people have been knowing me damn near most of my life at this point, there's still some that look at me like I'm crazy. I have a video, Daisy, you may have has seen this post where I talk about, like, in this video, I was touched by strangers over 50 something times on camera, because I was just like, I just need to record what it's like to make sure I'm not crazy. I was called boy, like I said before. I've been like harassed. I've had the police called on me in the archive. It is a very, very unsafe place if you are not familiar with it, especially, And so, and I'm not even a threatening Black person. Like, I'm really not, So like for those things to happen, it's telling what the next person will endure. And so I always do try to tell people that this work is not safe. Like, it's really not. You are in a battle. And I think that that's one way that our ancestors really come through when you're in it, when you're really in it. That's when they're like, oh, you went through this to find me? You went through this to find my name? I got you. And I can honestly say that that is an experience that I encounter all the time.
That's power, and that's the experience that you deserve. And as you keep doing this work, like Diane said, got to keep your protection game strong. But I'm assuming that everybody on this call prays for your further protection, that you may be wrapped in the arms of your ancestors in any environment that you go to, that you find what you need every time you step in that environment, and that your work continues to grow, and that your legacy is remembered for generations to come, because it is not safe and it is not easy, but doing the not safe, not easy thing always brings the blessings of power and everlasting life, as they would call it. So thank you.
I
Thank
love and
you.
appreciate that. That's probably the best prayer, the press affirmations that anybody has ever put over my head. I needed that. I appreciate that. Oh my goodness, may Spirit just bless all of y'all on this call. This has been so good for me.
Thank you. Oh, okay. So we definitely want to make sure that you get your contact information out there. So please let us know where we can find you, what services you offer, how to get in touch, and all that good stuff.
So right now, the best thing, I'm going to put my email on here, is to shoot me an email as soon as you can, even if it just says, hi, I was in the class with you, bye. Like, just shoot me an email so that way I can have your name and your contact. And then I'm going to add you to another email list that has updates with some of the projects that we're going on. I left out in my introduction what I work on. So I run a little organization called Kin Connector. Right now we are on our third relaunch. Kin Connector is basically a platform and community where Black folks and other people of color, but mostly Black folks, can learn their family history and engage with it in a way that's informative, safe, and actually powerful and healing. So those experiences, those horror stories that we talked about today, that's a drop in the bucket, but also that's not all this stuff is. But I specifically have grown up in this, and I have what it takes to be able to navigate it pretty easily and fastly. But for those people that are starting, I don't think that everybody needs to be a researcher. That's time consuming, it's expensive. But what I look to do is to make this to where this is something that we can all just push a button and be able to have our family histories there. So Kin Connector's biggest project is a database of enslaved family histories. So not just, Sarah, 5 years old, Black, belongs to Mr. Jones. That is not a family history. But who is Sarah? Sarah was born in 1835. Her mama is so-and-so. Her father is so-and-so, or maybe so-and-so. This is what happened to her during slavery. This is who she married after. This is where she lived. This is what their family did. These are her descendants, at least to a certain, point respecting privacy. These are her ancestors. And then you can plug yourself into that and say, okay, cool. At least I know this branch of my family. And then you can collaborate with other people who may have either also descended from that Sarah, or be, someone who was in community with that Sarah in some ways, in shape and form. What we've learned over the years is that Black genealogy has to be collaborative. It is not just about our own direct lines, but it's about all the people that they engaged with and interacted with. And so you'll see in the next month, the relaunch of Kin Connector, you'll be able to make profiles, connect with people, collaborate similarly to how you do on Ancestry, but just with a sense of safety, with actual education and collaboration. It's a really big thing, and it's my life work. I started it as a way for me to just survive and do what I love, and it's turned into something that I was like, this is more for all of our people. And then I also do offer services through Kin Connector as well. Typically what I do is I have you fill out a form that asks what you know about your family history, what you're looking to know, and if there's anything that, might prevent us from knowing about this. And then we go from there. I assess and see if it's something that I, will easily be able to do. I give a time frame, and then we go from there. I also do DNA analysis, which using Ancestry DNA typically, I go through and I break down your DNA results, particularly the relative finders, and show exactly how those people are related to you. So that way we can use that to take your family history back even further. I organize family reunions as well. That's one of my favorite things to do. And I also plan and develop basically ancestral tourism. Depending on where your folks are from, I have a network of culture bearers and culture workers all over the country and also internationally of folks who will be able to take you around and say, okay, this is one of the most significant landmarks for people in, Danville, Virginia, or Owasso, Alabama. This is, at least if that person doesn't know your people, let's go over to Second Mount Zion Baptist Church where your family, practiced and worshiped at. Or let me show you what the Rootwork or Hoodoo history of this community is, that white folks just will not show you or don't want you to go to or see. If your people are from somewhere that is historically unsafe for Black people, we have somebody to steward you through that process if that's something that you'd be interested in, actually physically being able to be where your ancestors lived. And so that's just a drop in the bucket of what I do and the services that I offer. And so if anybody is interested in that, please, please, please let me know. I would love to work with people in this community. You all have been so gracious and kind to me. I would love to just give whatever I could to you guys as well. But also I am active on social media most of the time, sometimes too much. So please feel free to reach out to me there, and you can follow some of my work there. I am not corporate whatsoever. So one day you might be getting me posting, Keisha Cole lyrics. Sometimes you might be getting me posting a whole thread about the history of the slave trade, and how it impacts Black people. So, I'm somebody's son too. But that's pretty much it. I'm an open book and very accessible. So please, please, please use me as a resource. If you, don't want to work directly with me, but you just want to keep me in your back pocket, send me a question, send me whatever, and you can go from there. Ways to support the work that we're doing is, one, to get involved with Kin Connector. We extract records, we collect records and digitize records. And so if you ever have, a few hours on your hands and you want to just, transcribe some old historic documents, I got a team for you. If you want to just contribute more indirectly with money blessings, there's also ways to support that way. And we are always open to that too. If you have ideas that we can utilize that you think would be helpful for you or for our people or just in general, let me know, collaborate, please. This is not about me, this is about us. And this is really, I don't have no plan B, C, or D after this. This is what my life has kind of come to at this point.
Well, if we have anything to do with it, you won't need no plan B, C, or D.
Come on.
This is the work. And please, if you have a cash tag or whatever they calling them these days, any place where people can drop a couple dollars in your collection plate for the blessing that you have given us today.
I really appreciate that. I am mostly on Cash App under Kin Connector. Also, by the way, the website for our org is called kinconnector.co. At the moment, the website is not available to the public because we're doing basically beta testing. But if you would like to experience that, again, send me your email or send an email to me that you'd be interested. And one of the cool things is that we research at least one line of your family to kind of get you started and acclimated on it if you want to be part of this beta, the beta testing for the site. And so that would be something to offer those of you that just want a quick way to get started. It would be about a 2-month process, but nonetheless, we're looking to launch in March. And so all of you guys will be able to access that site, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, we're gonna scream it from the rooftops. This is, it's been a long time of kind of like aggregating Black-owned genealogy or family history tree resources. I know that people, at least from what I've seen, I've had a list of names of folks who were genealogists who just do not do the work anymore. So right. the fact that you're still here, that you are a resource and you're so graciously offering everything you're offering is just a dream come true. And I'm so honored to have had this conversation with you.
Same. Thank you so much, Daisy, and to all of you, Ashe, and I hope that you all stay well throughout this weekend.
Thank you, you too. Have a beautiful rest of your night. Everybody, love you so much. Thank you for showing up. I hope this was a blessing to you, and be well.
All of you guys, take care.